The heavy mahogany gavel of Courtroom 7B remains suspended in midair, held by the trembling, furious hand of Judge Everett Sloan. The atmosphere inside the chamber is suffocatingly hot, thick with the scent of old paper and systemic fear. At the center of the room stands Clare Donnelly, a woman clad in blood-spattered scrubs and a tattered, scorched military jacket that looks like an insult to the pristine marble surrounding her. Two armed security officers advance toward her with their hands resting on their leather holsters, ready to execute the judge's merciless directive to tear the garment from her body. Mason Keene watches from the defense table, his knuckles bone white, knowing that if she removes that jacket, the darkest secrets of her past will be violently laid bare to a room full of predatory strangers. Outside the heavy exit doors, the rhythmic clicking of heavy military boots approaches, carrying a force that is about to collide head-on with the absolute authority of the bench. The heavy cedar doors of Courtroom 7B swung open with a slow, resonant groan that cuts straight through the low hum of legal murmurings.
What is he doing here?
Every single head in the packed gallery turned synchronized toward the back of the room. A collective breath was caught and held by the spectators. Standing in the threshold was a woman who looked like an active combat zone had just spat her out onto the polished marble floors of the San Diego County Superior Court building. Her dark blue nursing scrubs were stiffened, stained with dried, rust-colored blood that had soaked through the fabric around the waist and lapels. Over the scrubs, she wore a battered tactical jacket of faded olive drab, the color of old mountain moss. The left shoulder bore a dark, jagged burn mark that defied years of rigorous washing. The cuffs were completely frayed, showing white threads against weathered fabric. The chest pockets had been clumsily re-stitched by amateur hands, using uneven black twine. On the right shoulder, pressed against a strip of worn Velcro, sat a patch embroidered with simple black letters that read, Phantom 4. Her hair was bound in a tight, mercilessly practical knot, the unmistakable mark of someone who had not looked in a mirror for over a day and a half. At the defense table, Mason Keene raised his chin. His jaw clenched so hard the muscles bunched beneath his skin. A complex mixture of profound gratitude and absolute dread washed across his rugged features. He shook his head a single millimeter, a silent, desperate command that screamed to her to get out of here and not do this for him. Up on the raised bench, Judge Everett Sloan looked down through the silver rims of his reading glasses. He was a man who had spent 19 years operating under the absolute conviction that the worth of a human being could be thoroughly calculated within the first 30 seconds of observation. He despised disorder, and the woman standing before him was the very definition of chaos. Every ruling he had ever handed down had been built on the comfortable premise that presentation was character, and nothing about the figure in the doorway fit inside that premise. "Take that off," Judge Sloan said. His voice cracked across the courtroom like a gavel striking polished walnut. It was loud, resonant, and practiced in its capacity to make ordinary people feel small. Clare Donnelly did not flinch. She simply stood perfectly straight, shoulders squared, spine aligned with the rigid, unnatural discipline that only soldiers and survivors ever truly master. She looked directly into the eyes of the man on the bench. The judge leaned forward, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson.
"I said, take that filthy garment off, young lady," he continued. "Your current appearance is an absolute affront to the dignity of these legal proceedings. This is a court of law, not a visual shelter for vagrants or a military convention. You will divest yourself of that tactical gear before you dare to take a single step toward my witness stand."
Clare remained motionless, her arms hanging loosely at her sides. Her level gaze never wavered from his face. I have just completed a 36-hour shift at Pacific Mercy Medical Center, Your Honor, she said. Her voice was flat, rhythmic, and completely devoid of emotional ornamentation. It was the exact tone she used when telling a devastated family that their loved one was gone. Modest, clear, but utterly impossible to soften. There was a mass casualty incident on Interstate 5 involving 17 patients, 4 critical cases, and 2 emergency surgeries where I was required to assist the attending surgeons.
My clean clothes are at my home, which is 20 minutes in the opposite direction. Mason Keene has been waiting 3 weeks for this hearing. I am here to testify. I am not interested in your scheduling difficulties or your workplace wardrobe, Judge Sloan retorted, his hand slamming onto the wooden surface with a sharp slap. That jacket is a piece of unauthorized military paraphernalia. It is inappropriate, dirty, and I want it out of my sight. You will comply immediately, or I will hold you in contempt of court. You will spend the next 48 hours in a holding cell, and your entire testimony will be struck from the record permanently. The gallery murmured in response. Representatives from the wealthy Langston family smiled coldly from the front row. Mason Keene looked down at his scarred knuckles, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew what lay beneath that jacket. He knew the immense cost of exposing it to the light. Claire looked at Mason, then looked back at the judge on the bench. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a taut wire ready to snap under pressure. I prefer to keep it on, she said softly.
And despite
I cannot explain why to this room right now, but I am asking for your tolerance. The judge snapped completely, his patience evaporating. Officers, he barked, pointing 2 fingers toward the large security guards flanking the entrance. Approach the witness. Assist her in complying with the instructions of this court immediately. Remove that jacket from her shoulders. The 2 armed officers uncrossed their arms and began walking toward Claire, their heavy leather boots thudding against the carpeted floor. The trap was sprung. The defense was seconds away from losing its only objective voice, and Claire was standing on the precipice of a dangerous confrontation. The guards closed the distance, their shadows falling over her scrubs. Claire did not take a step back.
Her posture did not alter into a traditional defensive stance, but an icy weight settled over her shoulders. Her eyes locked onto the first officer, and the entire room felt the temperature drop. She prepared herself for whatever was coming next, knowing the truth could not be buried today. To understand the immense weight of the silence that currently gripped Courtroom 7B, one had to look back 8 months into the past, away from the sterile, high-ceilinged rooms of institutional justice, down to a weathered community center sitting on the edge of the industrial waterfront. Clare Donnelly had gone to that coastal community center as a volunteer for a trauma recovery program designed specifically for combat veterans. It was the only way she could force herself into spaces where people talked about the war without feeling the suffocating, crushing pressure of her own memories. She preferred to stay firmly in the shadows, organizing coffee cups and checking registration sheets, ensuring no one ever asked her to speak about her own past or her own service. Mason Keene had been present on her very first night at the center. He sat in the absolute farthest corner of the back row, his arms locked tight across his chest, his legs stretched out like tripods in front of him. He radiated a very specific, terrifying brand of absolute stillness. It was not the calm that comes from finding inner peace, but rather the heavy internal decision to stop fighting every single room he walked into. He had checked out of the civilian world entirely, leaving only a hard, protective armor behind. Throughout the 2-hour session, Mason did not utter a single syllable to anyone. Neither did Claire. They existed as 2 distinct, isolated islands of silence in a sea of shared pain.
When the meeting concluded and the participants began to filter out into the cool coastal evening, Claire remained behind to pack away the informational brochures on the wooden table. As she reached across the surface, her left wrist suddenly seized. A sharp, white-hot bolt of intense nerve pain shot straight up her forearm, causing her fingers to curl into an involuntary claw. She stopped moving, breathing shallowly through her nose, slowly rotating the joint in a precise, practiced manner to release the trapped nerve. She looked up and realized Mason Keene was standing 5 feet away from her. He was watching her injured wrist with an expressionless face. He did not offer empty pity. He did not ask the standard, exhausting questions that well-meaning civilians always asked. He simply reached into his jacket pocket, retrieved a cold, unopened bottle of water, set it gently on the table within her reach, turned around, and walked out into the darkness alone.
In that brief, wordless exchange, Claire understood everything she needed to know about Mason. He was a person who had looked into the abyss long enough to recognize its marks on others. He knew exactly when to speak, and more importantly, he knew exactly when silence was the greatest gift you could offer a fellow survivor. From that night forward, an unspoken alliance formed between them. They were not conventional friends who shared meals or discussed the mundane details of daily life. They were two deep-sea divers who recognized each other by the weight of the invisible gear they carried. They would sit on the public pier for hours, watching the gray Navy vessels navigate the harbor, saying absolutely nothing, yet communicating with perfect clarity. It took 11 weeks before either of them said more than a passing sentence to the other. The break came on an ordinary Tuesday, when a well-meaning new counselor at the center, a young man fresh out of graduate school, sat down across from Claire during the mandatory check-in circle and asked her, gently but directly, what branch she had served in and what her unit designation had been. It was a routine question, the kind asked in every trauma group in the country. Claire's jaw tightened. Her hands, resting in her lap, curled slightly at the knuckles. For 3 full seconds, she said nothing at all, and the silence had a texture to it, heavy and dangerous, like a held breath before a dive. Mason answered before she had to. "She's with me," he said simply, his voice low and final, the kind of sentence that closed a door rather than opened one. The counselor, sensing something he did not fully understand, nodded and moved the circle along to the next participant. Claire did not thank Mason out loud. She did not need to. Later that evening, on the pier, she finally broke the long habit of silence between them. "You didn't have to do that," she said, watching a Navy destroyer slide slowly across the dark water. "I know," Mason answered. No turning back.
He was quiet for a long moment, turning something over in his hands, a small, worn metal disc that caught the last of the evening light before he closed his fist around it. But some questions aren't anyone's business until the person asking has earned the right to hear the answer. Nobody in that room has earned it. He paused, then added, almost too quietly to hear over the wind coming off the water, "Some of us don't get to answer those questions at all anymore. Not without breaking something that's still classified as sealed." Claire said nothing, but for the first time since she had walked into that community center, she felt something loosen in her chest, a fraction of an inch, no more. She recognized the shape of what he had just told her without him ever saying the words Phantom 4 out loud. She had seen the same shape in her own reflection every morning for years. Their alliance deepened after that night, though it remained sparse in words and rich in understanding. Mason began appearing outside Pacific Mercy Medical Center at the end of her worst shifts, never announced, simply present, leaning against his truck in the parking structure with 2 cups of coffee, one of which he would silently hand to her before driving her home, in a silence that felt nothing like loneliness. Claire, in turn, began keeping a second key to her apartment taped beneath the mailbox. An unspoken arrangement for the nights when Mason's own apartment became too loud with memory, and he needed somewhere quiet to simply exist until morning. Neither of them ever called it friendship. They did not have a word that felt honest enough for what it actually was.
What neither of them said, not even to each other, was that both of their names remained flagged in a federal database that neither of them had ever been permitted to see the contents of. A quiet, administrative tripwire, waiting for the day either one of them stepped somewhere visible enough to trigger it. That day was closer than either of them understood. One evening, roughly 6 weeks before the alley, a documentary about a recent overseas conflict happened to be playing on the community center's break room television while Claire refilled the coffee urn. A single frame flashed across the screen for less than 2 seconds, a grainy satellite image of a stretch of open desert before the segment cut away to something else entirely. It meant nothing to anyone else in the room. To Claire, it meant everything. Her hand froze around the coffee pot. The overhead lights seemed to dim at the edges of her vision, and for a moment she was not standing in a break room on the California coast at all. She was somewhere hotter, somewhere louder, with sand underfoot and a voice in her earpiece counting down numbers that no longer meant anything, except that 4 names were about to become 3. The moment lasted perhaps 4 seconds in real time. It felt, to Claire, like standing at the bottom of a well and looking up at a single small circle of daylight. Mason was across the room before she realized she had made a sound.
We just need to stay calm.
He did not touch her. He simply positioned his body between Claire and the television, blocking the screen entirely, and said her name once, low and even, the way you would speak to someone standing too close to a ledge. "Claire," he said,
I'm right here now.
"you're here. Not there. Here." It took 11 more seconds before her hand unclenched from around the coffee pot handle. Neither of them ever discussed that evening again. But from that point forward, Mason quietly made sure the break room television stayed off whenever they were both scheduled to volunteer. And Claire never asked him how he knew to do that without being told. That was the day she understood, without a single word of confirmation, that whatever had happened in that desert had not simply happened to her. It had happened to both of them, together, and neither of them had ever been permitted to speak its name to another living soul outside of a locked federal file. 3 weeks prior to the courtroom confrontation, that quiet alliance was put to the ultimate test. Mason was walking back to his truck through the long shadows of the gas lamp quarter after completing a late shift at a local vehicle repair shop. The midnight air was heavy with the smell of exhaust and cheap alcohol. As he passed a narrow alleyway behind a popular seafood restaurant, he heard a sound that caused his military training to override his civilian restraint. It was a woman's voice. It was not a loud, dramatic scream, but rather a tight, strangulated gasp. It was the specific sound made by someone who understood with absolute certainty that screaming would only accelerate the violence of her attackers. Mason turned into the dark alley without hesitation. His eyes adjusted to the shadows in a fraction of a second. 3 men, dressed in expensive, tailored clothing, were surrounding Paige Moreno, a young waitress who had just cleared the back door of the restaurant. One of the men, a tall youth named Trevor Langston, was pressing the silver blade of a folding knife directly against the outside of her jacket, his face twisted in an expression of arrogant amusement. What occurred over the course of the following 45 seconds was not an ordinary street brawl. It was the cold, calculated, and perfectly executed application of advanced close-quarters combat training against 3 untrained aggressors. Mason moved like a shadow, closing the distance before any of the 3 men fully registered that he had entered the alley. A single controlled strike put the first man down, and he did not get back up. A second, precise movement folded the second man over, the fight instantly gone out of him. Trevor Langston turned, swinging the folding knife wildly in a panicked arc, but Mason was already inside the range of the blade before it could complete its swing, and in 3 more seconds, it was over. Trevor went down hard against the brick wall and did not move. Mason did not flee the scene. He dropped down to his knees beside the young man he had just subdued, checking his breathing with the same clinical focus he had once used on the battlefield. Working with the calm, drilled precision of someone who had done exactly this kind of thing before, under conditions far worse than a dark alley behind a restaurant, Mason opened the boy's airway with an improvised tool from his own jacket pocket and kept him breathing, steady and controlled, until the wail of approaching sirens finally cut through the night. Paige Moreno sat frozen against the restaurant's back wall through all of it, her hands pressed over her own mouth, watching a total stranger calmly save the life of the man who, seconds earlier, had been holding a knife to her ribs. She would tell a hospital counselor months later that the strangest part of the entire night was not the violence itself, but how quiet Mason had become the instant it ended, as though some switch inside him had been thrown back off the moment the danger passed. She never got his name that night. He was gone before the first patrol car turned onto the street.
By the time the police cruisers arrived, the scene looked to 2 half-attentive patrol officers working the tail end of a long shift, like an unprovoked assault by an unhinged veteran against 3 unarmed citizens. The knife had mysteriously disappeared from the official record. Within 48 hours, Paige Moreno received a visit at her apartment from 2 men in expensive suits who introduced themselves only as representatives of the Langston family's legal office, and who strongly suggested, in careful, courteous language, that she take some time to consider exactly what she remembered before she gave any formal statement. Mason Keene was quietly recast, in every report that mattered, as a disturbed criminal who had attacked 3 innocent men without any provocation. And that was exactly how the powerful Langston family intended to frame the entire truth by the time it reached a jury. For the 8 days that followed, Mason told no one what had happened in that alley, not even Claire. He kept driving to the hospital parking structure with 2 cups of coffee. He kept saying nothing. But Claire noticed the new stillness in him, a stillness that sat differently than his usual quiet. Tighter, like a man waiting for a call he knew was eventually going to come. It came on the 9th day, in the form of a manila envelope taped to his apartment door, containing a single sheet of paper informing him that the state of California intended to charge him with aggravated assault and that his arraignment was scheduled for the following week. He read it twice, folded it into his jacket pocket, and drove to the pier alone that night, staring out at the black water for 3 hours before he finally called Claire and told her, in 11 flat words, that he was going to need a witness to what kind of man he actually was. The heavy ticking of the courtroom clock seemed to amplify the absolute silence that followed the judge's command. The 2 armed security officers stopped exactly 3 feet away from Clare Donnelly, their hands still resting near their leather holsters, waiting for a final nod from the bench to enforce the directive. Mason Keene leaned forward at the defense table, his voice cutting through the heavy air. "Your Honor, if I may speak," he said, his tone tight but perfectly controlled. "This witness is here to provide an objective account of the medical treatment rendered at the scene. Her attire does not alter the facts of that night." "Sit down, Mr. Keene," Judge Sloan snapped, his hand hovering over his gavel. "Your attorney will speak for you, or I will have you removed for disrupting these proceedings. The rules of decorum apply to everyone, regardless of their medical background or their past associations.
Claire did not look at Mason. She kept her eyes fixed on the silver rims of the judge's glasses. The dark patch on her right shoulder, bearing the words Phantom 4, seemed to catch the harsh fluorescent lighting of the room. To the gallery, it was just a strip of fabric, but to the legal team representing the Langston family, it was a liability. The lead prosecutor, Richard Vance, stood up slowly from his table. He smoothed the front of his tailored three-piece suit, his expression a calculated mixture of professional concern and subtle disdain.
We are here seeking
Your Honor,
justice,
the state
pure
shares the
and
court's
simple.
concern regarding the
And the
witness's
truth,
presentation,
members of the
Vance
jury,
said,
points
his
in
voice
only
smooth
one
and
direction.
practiced. However,
It was you.
the prosecution is
You are
prepared
the
to
one who
proceed with the
authorized
questioning,
payment to the
provided the
Shell
witness
Corporation.
acknowledges that her
Admit it.
choice of clothing is not intended
was
as an
you.
attempt to
You
influence
were
the
one
jury
who authorized
or
the
project an
payment to the Shell
unearned
Corporation.
narrative of
Admit it.
military authority. Claire turned her head slightly, her gaze locking onto Vance.
I am not projecting a narrative, she said, her voice dropping an octave. This jacket
did what was
belonged to
necessary.
someone who cannot
The
stand
law
here
couldn't
today.
stop them, so I had to.
It is not a prop. That is
Counsel,
exactly the issue,
approach
Ms.
the
Donnelly,
bench.
Judge Sloan said,
Your behavior
leaning so
in
far
my
forward, his
courtroom
black
will not
robes
be
pulled tight
tolerated.
across his shoulders.
Let me be
You are bringing
perfectly
personal
clear.
sentiments and external symbols
Your
into a neutral
behavior
space.
in this courtroom
This court does
will
not
not
adjudicate
be
based on history
tolerated.
or old loyalties. We
Based on
examine
the evidence
evidence.
presented, this court finds
Now,
the defendant
for the
guilty
final
on
time,
all charges.
Remove the
You are
jacket
hereby
or
sentenced
step
to
away
life
from the stand.
imprisonment.
Before the officers could take another step, the heavy double doors at the rear of the courtroom groaned open once more. The sharp, synchronized click of heavy leather soles echoed against the marble threshold. A man in a crisp, dark blue suit walked into the gallery. His hair was cropped short, graying at the temples, and his posture matched the rigid discipline that Claire had displayed moments earlier.
He carried a thick manila folder tucked firmly under his left arm. He did not look at the spectators or the media representatives sitting in the back rows. He walked straight down the center aisle toward the wooden bar that separated the gallery from the litigation well. Your
The
Honor,
evidence presented
the man
clearly
said,
demonstrates
his
that my
voice
client
carrying a
acted in
resonant
self-defense.
authority that demanded
We ask
attention
the court
without
to
needing to
consider the
shout.
facts.
My name is David
You may call
Vance,
this a
representing the
hearing,
Department of Regional
but I
Security
see a
Affairs.
calculated
I'm here to
attempt
deliver a federal protective order
undermine a
regarding the
lawful
witness currently
investigation.
standing before you. The prosecutor, Richard Vance, stiffened at the sound of the name, his hands gripping the edge of his table. The similarity in their surnames was not a coincidence, but the cold look exchanged between the two men suggested a deep, unresolved history. Judge Sloan frowned, his hand dropping away from the gavel. A protective order, he asked,
Based on the
his tone shifting
inconsistencies
from
I've noted
anger
here,
to deep
I have
suspicion.
serious
This
doubts
is a
about the
state-level
veracity of
criminal
your
hearing,
statements.
Mr. Vance. Federal
That is
interventions
completely
require
out of
proper
order.
filing
Your
48 hours in
objection is
advance.
overruled,
You
and I
cannot
am
simply
warning
walk
you
into
right
my
now to
courtroom and
cease
disrupt a
this
scheduled
behavior or
testimony.
face the consequences.
The federal representative stepped through the wooden gate, approaching the bench with measured strides. He opened the manila folder and extracted a document bearing a dark blue institutional seal. Under Section 12
Your
of
Honor,
the Emergency Security
the
Protocol,
prosecution would like
the
to
federal
submit
government
this
maintains
evidence.
jurisdiction over any proceedings involving active personnel or classified
Your Honor,
equipment related to the
the
Phantom 4
prosecution would like
initiative,
to submit
David
this
Vance stated,
evidence.
handing the document to the bailiff. The jacket worn by Ms. Donnelly is classified as government property under that specific protocol. Forcing
here
its
today to
removal in a
ensure that
public
justice
forum
is served.
constitutes a
The
breach
facts are
of
clear,
national
and the
security
law must be
regulations.
applied accordingly.
That
A sharp
testimony
murmur
completely
rippled
contradicts
through the gallery.
alibi.
The representatives of the Langston family began
have
whispering
to do something
urgently to
now.
their legal team.
Mason Keene watched the exchange, his eyes widening slightly as he realized the situation was spiraling far beyond a simple street fight or an act of self-defense. Judge Sloan adjusted his glasses, scanning the document with an increasingly tight expression. His authority was being systematically eroded by a single piece of paper, and his frustration was palpable.
This document outlines a restriction on physical evidence, the judge said, his voice flat. It does not grant immunity to the defendant, nor does it excuse the witness from answering questions regarding the events of that night. The federal representative turned to look at Clare, his expression unreadable. The state may question the witness, Your Honor, he said, but the jacket stays on, and any question touching upon her service record or the origin of that garment will be met with an immediate assertion of federal privilege. Clare remained perfectly still, her face an impenetrable mask. She had not asked for this intervention, and she knew that the arrival of David Vance meant the quiet life she had built at the hospital was officially over. The alliance between her and Mason was no longer a hidden bond between two survivors. It was now a matter of record, and the wolves were officially at the door. Judge Everett Sloan let out a long, slow breath through his nose, the sound carrying a heavy weight of deep dissatisfaction. He waved his hand toward the two armed security officers, dismissing them back to their original positions near the heavy cedar doors. The federal document remained flat on his wooden desk, its blue institutional seal gleaming beneath the bright lights. "Very well, Mr. Vance," Judge Sloan said, his voice flat and tight. "The court will recognize the federal protective order regarding the witness's attire. Ms. Donnelly, you may take the stand. However, I remind you that you are under oath. Any attempt to evade direct questions regarding the physical events of 3 weeks ago will result in immediate sanctions."
You understand me?
Clare Donnelly walked forward, her heavy leather shoes making no sound against the carpeted floor of the litigation well. She stepped up into the wooden witness box, her posture remaining perfectly straight. She placed her right hand on the small Bible presented by the bailiff and swore her oath with a clear, steady voice that did not contain a single tremor. Richard Vance, the lead prosecutor, adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit and walked to the center of the floor. He carried no notes, relying instead on his 30 years of experience in dismantling hostile witnesses. "Ms. Donnelly, let us begin with your arrival at the scene," Richard Vance said, his voice carrying a warm conversational tone that was entirely manufactured. "You stated earlier that you had just finished a long shift at the hospital.
What exactly did you see when your vehicle entered the alleyway behind the restaurant?
I saw 3 men on the ground," Clare replied immediately. "One was unconscious, one was struggling to breathe, and Trevor Langston was suffering from a severe airway obstruction caused by physical trauma to his face and jaw. Mason Keene was kneeling beside him, performing an emergency procedure." "An emergency procedure," Vance repeated, turning slightly toward the gallery where the Langston family sat. "You are referring to the moment the defendant opened Trevor Langston's airway using an improvised tool, correct?" "Yes," Clare said. "And, as a trained medical professional, would you agree that improvising an airway in a dark alley without sterile equipment is a highly dangerous, reckless act that could easily cause fatal complications?" "Under ordinary circumstances, yes," Clare answered, her eyes locking onto his. "But under those specific circumstances, it was the only action that prevented Trevor Langston from suffocating before the paramedics arrived. Mason Keene saved his life." "Let us discuss the timeline more precisely," Vance continued, changing direction with the smooth ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. "You have testified that you arrived at the alley shortly after the confrontation had already concluded, yet your own hospital time clock places you leaving Pacific Mercy at 11:52 that night, a full 9 minutes before the first call reached dispatch. Can you explain that discrepancy to this court, Ms. Donnelly? Or is your memory of that evening simply as unreliable as your choice of courtroom attire?" "Objection," the defense attorney said sharply, rising halfway out of his chair. "Argumentative, and the prosecutor is testifying rather than questioning." "Sustained," Judge Sloan said.
And the motion is
Confine
hereby
yourself to
denied.
questions, Mr.
Sentencing will
Vance.
proceed
Vance inclined his head in a shallow, insincere apology and turned back to the witness box. 9 minutes, Ms.
Look at
Donnelly,
me.
he repeated, softer this time.
It was
more
your
dangerous for
negligence
it.
that caused his death,
Where were
wasn't
you
it?
during those 9 minutes? Claire did not blink.
Consequences of my actions.
I stopped my car 2
and
blocks
I
away to
accept
check on
them.
my own vehicle's tire pressure warning
But I
light, she
stand
said,
by my
her voice
decision.
utterly level. I have the
My training
dashboard
dictates
alert
that these
logged
steps
on my
were
phone,
necessary to ensure patient
time-stamped
safety,
if the
and
court
records
requires
confirm
it.
this.
I did not
understand
witness the initial
implications of
confrontation.
my testimony
I
here
witnessed its
today,
immediate aftermath,
but I
and I've been
stand by my
entirely
sworn
consistent about that
statement.
from the first moment I
We
spoke to
followed
hospital
every
security.
protocol.
Vance held her gaze for a long beat, searching for the crack he had been certain was there, and found none. He let the silence stretch just long enough for the jury to notice his disappointment before pressing forward into new ground. "Let us set the knife aside for a moment," Vance said, pivoting again with practiced ease, the smile never quite reaching his eyes. "I would like to ask about your professional record, Ms. Donnelly. Isn't it true that you have been formally referred on 2 separate occasions in the past 18 months for a psychological fitness review by your own hospital's employee wellness office?" A murmur rippled through the gallery. Mason's jaw tightened at the defense table. Claire did not look away. "Yes," she said simply.
Look at me
"And
when I'm
isn't it
asking you
true,"
this.
Vance pressed,
Your
his voice
testimony
rising just
contradicts
slightly,
the evidence we have
that
right
those
here.
referrals followed incidents
Look at me
in
when
which
I'm asking you
colleagues
this.
expressed concern
Your
about your
testimony
reaction to certain
contradicts the evidence we have
triggering
right
stimuli
here.
in the workplace. Incidents consistent, perhaps, with combat-related post-traumatic stress? "Objection,"
Your
the
Honor.
defense attorney
This
said,
testimony
half
is
rising.
completely inappropriate,
"Relevance,
and I
Your
move to
Honor.
have it stricken.
The witness's
Based on the
medical
lack of
history
credible
is
evidence,
not on trial
we move for
here.
an immediate-
Goes
Your Honor, the
directly
evidence clearly
to
establishes-
reliability of
Proceed,
perception
counsel.
and
Witness
memory,"
testimony and
Vance
document
countered
proving intent. We ask
smoothly,
for a guilty verdict.
still
Noted.
facing the
Anything
bench.
further?
If the
Members
witness
of the
is prone
jury
to
must
dissociative
consider the
episodes,
human cost
the jury
of
has
this
a right
crime.
to weigh that against her
Justice
account of a
demands that we
chaotic,
hold the defendant
poorly lit
accountable for
crime
his
scene.
actions.
Judge Sloan considered this for a long moment, his fingers drumming once against the bench.
Order in the court.
"I will allow
The
a
defense's
narrow
motion is hereby
answer,"
denied.
he said
We
finally.
will proceed as planned.
"Ms.
with the
Donnelly,
sentencing this
you may
afternoon.
respond,
Order in the court.
but Mr. Vance will
defense's
not
motion
be
is hereby
permitted to turn
denied.
this witness
We will
box
proceed
into a
as planned with
competency
the
hearing."
sentencing this afternoon.
Claire's voice, when it came, had not changed in pitch or speed, but something in it had sharpened, the way a scalpel is sharper for being quiet. "Those referrals
I
are
acted
standard
according
hospital
to my
protocol," she
training
said.
and the
"Any nurse
Hippocratic
who has
oath.
served in a combat zone
My
and later treats
priority
mass
has
casualty trauma
always
cases
been the
is
patient's
flagged for periodic
well-being.
review. It is not a
I've
diagnosis.
told you the
It is a
truth
policy,
about what happened.
applied evenly to every veteran
My
on staff,
testimony
and I have
stands.
passed both reviews with a full return to unrestricted duty." Then she paused, and for the first time in the entire cross-examination, she allowed something almost like contempt to surface in her voice. "If Mr.
You can
Vance
question
is
my
suggesting that a
methods,
person
but
who
you
has been shot
cannot
at
question my
cannot also
integrity.
be trusted to correctly
I
count
stand by
how
my
many men were
report.
on the ground in that alley,
You can
I would
question
invite
my
him to spend
methods,
36
but you
hours in
cannot
my emergency
question my
room
integrity.
and then tell me whose
I
perception he
stand by
trusts
my
less."
report.
A ripple of
Understand
quiet,
this.
uncomfortable
This court
laughter
will not
moved through the
tolerate
gallery
further
before Judge
disruptions.
Sloan silenced it
Consider
with a
this
single
your
sharp
final
look.
warning.
Vance's ears reddened. He abandoned the line of questioning and returned to safer ground, his voice noticeably less certain than it had been 5 minutes earlier.
The evidence
Let us
clearly
look
shows
at
you
that
were there
private
that night.
history, then,
So tell the court,
since it
where
speaks
were you when
directly
the
to
victim was
your
attacked?
objectivity. You and Mr. Keene attend the same community center on the waterfront, a center dedicated to veterans suffering from severe psychological trauma.
And
You
that
sit together
is
in
the
silence for hours.
undeniable truth.
Is it true that you possess a shared
You
history
lied
involving
to
the
the
military
court,
initiative known as
and you
Phantom
obstructed
4?
justice?
David Vance, the federal representative standing near the wooden gate, stepped forward instantly. Your Honor, I object under the terms of the Federal
The
Protective
integrity of
Order,
these
he
proceedings
said,
depends
his voice
entirely
cutting
on
through the
the
room
truth
like a
being
blade.
revealed.
The witness's military service and any connection to classified initiatives are completely barred from these proceedings. Richard Vance did not look at the federal representative. He kept his eyes on Claire, watching her reaction. I am not asking about national security secrets, Your Honor, the prosecutor argued, turning to the bench. I'm asking about a bias. If this witness belongs to an exclusive, secretive group with the defendant, her testimony regarding his character and his actions cannot be considered objective. The jury deserves to know if they are listening to an independent medical expert or a loyal companion covering up a crime.
Judge Sloan looked down at the document, his face tight with conflict. The question touches on bias, Mr. Vance, the judge told the federal representative. I will allow the witness to answer if she shares an institutional bond with the defendant without revealing any classified operations. Clare looked at Mason. His face was pale, his eyes telling her to stop, to let the prosecution win this point rather than risk what she was protecting. Claire turned her gaze back to the prosecutor.
What I did was difficult.
We do not share an
But it was
institutional
necessary to
bond,
save
she
those
said
lives.
slowly. We share a survival bond. When you have seen the things we have seen, you do not need a badge or a uniform to recognize someone who is willing to put their own life between a predator and a victim. Mason Keene did not go into that alley to start a fight. He went in to stop one. And the knife you are claiming does not exist was in Trevor Langston's right hand when I arrived. I saw it, and I kicked it under a dumpster myself while I was trying to save his life. The courtroom exploded into a sudden wave of frantic whispers. Richard Vance's face turned dark as his carefully constructed narrative suffered its first major fracture. The sound of Judge Sloan slamming his mahogany gavel down 3 distinct times vibrated through the wooden benches of the gallery. Silence, the judge commanded, his voice sharp enough to cut through the rising wave of murmurs. One more outburst from the spectators and I will clear this room entirely. Richard Vance stood frozen in the center of the floor, his fingers twitching against the fabric of his trousers. The revelation of the missing weapon was a direct blow to the prosecution's carefully manicured presentation. He recovered his composure within 2 seconds, his face hardening into an expression of absolute disbelief. You kicked a weapon under a dumpster, Ms. Donnelly? Vance asked, his tone dripping with theatrical sarcasm. A trained trauma nurse walks into a highly volatile active crime scene and casually alters physical evidence before the police arrive. And yet, there is no mention of this knife in the initial statements you provided to the responding officers at the hospital. Why did you remain silent about this supposed weapon until this very moment? Because the responding officer was Officer Marcus Langston, Claire replied, her voice remaining perfectly steady, dropping the name like a heavy stone into a quiet pool of water. He is the cousin of the individual currently claiming to be the victim. When I attempted to hand him the weapon details during his intake interview at the hospital, he told me to focus on my medical duties and leave the investigation to the professionals. He refused to log my statement. Vance opened his mouth to object, but Claire did not pause. I knew that if I left the knife in the alley, it would disappear completely, Claire continued, looking directly at the jury box. So I did not leave it there. After the paramedics departed with Trevor Langston, I returned to the alleyway. I recovered the silver folding knife from beneath the dumpster using a sterile specimen bag from my tactical kit. It has been secured in a biohazard locker at Pacific Mercy Medical Center under my private access code for the past 21 days. It bears the biological tissue of Paige Moreno on the tip and the distinct fingerprints of Trevor Langston on the handle. The defense attorney, who had been sitting in stunned silence, stood up so fast his wooden chair scraped loudly against the floor. Your Honor, the defense requests an immediate recess to allow the independent recovery and forensic testing of this evidence. This alters the entire foundation of the state's aggravated assault charges.
This is a complete fabrication and a violation of discovery rules, Vance shouted, his usual calm demeanor vanishing entirely as he turned to the bench. The witness is introducing unverified, highly irregular physical elements into the record without prior notice to the state. We object to any recess. Judge Sloan rubbed his temples, his face pale with a mixture of anger and bureaucratic panic. He looked at the federal representative, David Vance, who simply stood near the gate with his arms crossed, his expression showing no surprise whatsoever. The federal government had known about the knife all along. They had simply waited for the state to lock itself into a fraudulent narrative before springing the trap. The court will take a 30-minute recess, Judge Sloan announced, his gavel striking the block a single time.
Based on the evidence
Ms. Donnelly,
presented,
you
this
will
court
remain in the
finds you
building.
guilty as
Bailiff,
charged.
secure the
You will
witness's
report
recorded
for
location
sentencing
details for the
tomorrow
medical
at
locker
9 a.m.
immediately.
Counsel, attend me in my chambers.
This is a
As the
travesty
judge
of
stood up
justice.
and retreated through the rear
How can they
door,
allow this?
the courtroom dissolved into absolute chaos. The Langston family representatives surged toward the prosecution table, their faces twisted in fury, whispering aggressively into Richard Vance's ear. At the defense table, Mason's attorney lowered himself back into his chair, exhaling for what felt like the first time in 10 minutes. That knife just turned a hopeless case into a fighting one, he said quietly,
We have a chance now.
more to himself than to his client. But it
must
also
listen to me
means
very
every
carefully.
camera in this building is going to
deviate from the
know
plan,
your
no matter
name
what
by
they
the
say.
6 o'clock news. Are
Remember
you
the plan.
prepared for that?
When they show the photos,
Mason kept his eyes on Claire, still standing in the witness box, her expression unreadable to everyone in the room except him. I stopped
understand
being
the gravity
prepared
of
for
the
a normal
situation.
life the day I
I
signed up
accept
for
the
Phantom
consequences
4,
of my actions,
he said
whatever they may
quietly. What matters now is whether she's prepared for what she just started. Claire stepped down from the witness box. Her scrubs were still stained. Her tactical jacket still bore the faded patch of Phantom 4, but her shoulders were lighter. She walked past the defense table, where Mason Keene looked up at her. You should not have done
didn't do
that,
it, I swear.
Mason whispered, his voice
You
thick
know I
with
didn't
emotion.
do it.
They will come after your medical license now. They will ruin you. They
Look
can
at me.
try, Claire said softly,
We knew
stopping
this
for a
wouldn't
brief
be
second
easy.
beside his chair.
But we are ready
But they
for
forget
this.
one thing, Mason. We died in the desert years ago. Everything we are doing now is just playing with house money. She turned and walked down the center aisle, her eyes fixed on the exit doors, ready for the next phase of the battle. The heavy double doors of Courtroom 7B swung shut behind Clare Donnelly, cutting off the sharp, chaotic roar of the gallery. The corridor outside was long, lined with cold white terrazzo flooring that reflected the dim institutional lighting overhead. Claire did not walk toward the public elevators. Instead, she moved straight toward a small recessed alcove near the emergency exit, her breath hitching slightly for the first time since she had entered the building. The adrenaline that had sustained her through a 36-hour hospital shift and a hostile examination was finally beginning to recede, leaving a hollow, bone-deep fatigue in its wake. Before she could lean against the concrete wall, the sound of rapid, heavy footsteps echoed behind her. "Ms. Donnelly," a voice called out. It was sharp, controlled, and utterly familiar. She turned to see David Vance, the federal representative, walking toward her. He had bypassed the bailiffs and the clustering media reporters with the practiced ease of a man who moved through restricted spaces for a living. The manila folder was still tucked under his arm, but his face had lost the neutral, detached mask he had worn inside the courtroom.
You just threw a massive wrench into a very delicate machine, Claire, David said, stopping exactly 2 feet away from her. His voice was a low whisper, meant only for her ears. Retaining that knife was a direct violation of standard evidence protocols, civilian and military alike. You should have turned it over to our office the moment you secured it. And let it disappear into your registry of classified anomalies? Claire countered, her voice matching his low tone but carrying a sharp edge. If I had given that knife to you, David, it would have been buried under a black label before Mason's defense attorney could even file a discovery motion. You would have used it as leverage to force Mason into another contract, another deployment under the Phantom 4 banner. I know how your office operates. David Vance let out a short, humorless sigh, looking down at the terrazzo floor before fixing his gray eyes back on her face. We are trying to protect the integrity of the program, Claire.
If the Langston family digs deep enough into Mason's background during this trial, they will find the operational records from 5 years ago. They have the political connections to pull those files into the public record. Do you have any idea what happens if the details of the Sector 7 extraction become public knowledge? I care about the person who is currently sitting at that defense table facing 20 years for an act of mercy, Claire said, her hand tightening around the strap of her tactical kit. The program ended for me the day we left that desert. If Mason goes down, the truth about what happened to the rest of the unit goes down with him. I am not letting that happen. The heavy door to the judge's chambers opened at the far end of the hall, and Richard Vance stepped out into the corridor. The prosecutor looked flushed, his tie slightly loosened at the collar. He spotted David and Claire immediately, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure hostility as he marched toward them.
This is a coordinated ambush, Richard Vance said, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and professional humiliation as he stopped in front of the pair. A federal observer and a rogue witness working in tandem to subvert a state prosecution. I'm already preparing a formal complaint to the Attorney General's office. That knife will be excluded from evidence, Ms. Donnelly. I will personally guarantee it. Your chain of custody is non-existent. The chain of custody is perfectly preserved within a certified, time-stamped medical biohazard vault, Claire replied, turning her full attention to the prosecutor. The hospital's security logging system is automated and tamper-proof. Every single second that weapon spent in that locker is documented by digital surveillance. If you try to exclude it, Mr. Vance, the defense will simply call the hospital administrator to the stand, and the jury will see exactly how hard the state is working to hide the victim's own weapon. How do you think that will look on the local evening news?
Richard Vance opened his mouth to reply, but his phone began to vibrate violently inside his jacket pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and his face instantly drained of color. The caller identification showed the name of the patriarch of the Langston family. The prosecutor took 2 steps back, pointing a trembling index finger at Claire. "This is not over," he hissed, before turning on his heel and walking quickly toward a quiet corner of the hallway to answer the call. David Vance watched him go, a grim smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He turned back to Claire, his expression softening into something resembling genuine concern. You have won this specific round, Claire. The judge will have no choice but to allow the evidence in once the hospital log is verified. But you have just made an enemy out of the most powerful family in the county, and my office cannot shield you from a civil retaliation.
There is one more thing you should know before you walk back into that courtroom, David added, lowering his voice further, glancing once down the empty corridor. The patriarch you just watched Richard Vance take a call from does not operate through lawyers when he loses in public. 20 years ago, he operated through people like the ones you and Mason used to work with.
There is no turning back.
My office picked up a flagged communication out of a private security contractor with Langston ties 2 days ago. I cannot tell you what it said. I can tell you that it mentioned Mason Keene by name, and it did not mention a courtroom.
Claire's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes went very still. The particular stillness of a soldier recalculating a threat in real time. Then you'd better make sure that federal privilege of yours extends past these doors, David, she said quietly. Because if anyone goes near him outside of a courtroom, I promise you, the next thing that becomes public knowledge will not be a knife. I have been shot at by professional insurgents in 40-degree heat, David, Claire said, walking past him toward the courtroom doors. A few wealthy politicians in tailored suits do not scare me. Let them come. She stopped with her hand on the heavy brass door handle, not turning around. One more thing, David, she said, her voice quieter now, stripped of the edge she had carried through the entire hallway. That flagged communication you mentioned, the one with Mason's name on it and no courtroom attached to it. I want a copy on my desk by tomorrow morning, unredacted, or I start making calls to people who still owe me favors from the desert. People whose names are not in your registry. David Vance was quiet for a moment, studying her with something that looked almost like respect.
That could cost you everything you have left to lose, Claire, he said finally.
I already lost everything I was afraid to lose, Claire answered. What's left is just the part of me that doesn't know how to stop fighting for the people who would have died for me. She pushed the door open, and the roar of the reconvening courtroom swallowed the end of the sentence before David could respond. Behind her, through the closing gap in the doorway, she could just make out Mason rising from the defense table as the bailiff called the room back to order, his eyes already searching the crowd for hers, the way they always did, the way they had every single day since a bottle of water was set down on a wooden table 8 months ago, and neither of them had said a single word. If you want to continue following the suffocating confrontation between the shadow alliance of Phantom 4 and the ruthless forces of institutional power, do not miss the upcoming chapter of this high-stakes, dramatic series.
Hit the subscribe button right now, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comment section below to fuel the relentless journey for justice led by Clare Donnelly and Mason Keene. The battle has only just begun, and the darkest secrets are still waiting in the shadows ahead.